Hi, and welcome to another coffee break with Formation. So, today I want to talk about behavioral interviews and one of the common anti patterns that I have seen people do in preparing for them, which is to memorize answers to specific questions. And I've talked about this before in previous videos with regard to technical interview prep, but it also applies to behavioral interviews. And, what I'll see is a lot of people crafting and writing up paragraphs of answers and trying their best to memorize just pages and pages worth of answers and practicing the exact wording of their delivery. And the problem with this, there's a couple of problems. So the first most obvious consequence is that interviewers will always intentionally poke around and try to dig behind your answers, and one, to kind of throw you off and get the genuine story, but often because they are also testing for specific traits and they need to dig and poke at your story to get signal on the specific traits. An interviewer that's trying to test for your grit is going to ask a different follow-up question than someone who is trying to test for, code quality. And if you are only able to deliver perfectly word-crafted answers, you will be entirely unprepared for these follow-up questions. And on top of this, I think really importantly is when you memorize these answers, you will be way, way more nervous because you aren't actually comfortable in talking about these topics, and you will be too focused on delivering kind of the exact wording of your prepared answer and being less in the moment, enjoying your conversation and answering the questions that your interviewer is asking directly. And this directness is super important. One of the most common failure modes of a behavioral interview is just inability to collect signal. An interviewer might ask a follow-up question, really testing to see your kind of your reaction to time pressure, and you're responding with a canned answer that isn't delivering an answer to their question. And when there's weak signal, that typically leads to a no. The last thing is, I will say that if you're kind of not in the moment with your interviewer, you will have less fun and be way less likely to build a real connection with your interviewer to cause them to want to really root for you. So if not memorizing your answers, what can you do instead? So I have a couple of practical tips. So one, when preparing for your answers, never write paragraph answers. So write bullet points instead. So that forces you to focus more on the content and less on the exact wording. Two, this one's really obvious and probably a lot of you are doing this, but practice with friends and ask them to ask you as many follow-up questions as possible on every topic. And ideally try to practice with friends who think very differently so that you can get questions from as many angles as possible. And finally, this one's a little different. Try to get your team to practice with you. And what I mean by this, and this does require you to prepare while you're doing the project rather than in retrospect, but by thinking about how you want to talk about a project while you're working on a project, you can ask your PMs, your team leads, or people that you respect some of the questions that you expect to get and want to be able to answer well. Why did we make certain decisions this way? What were the alternatives that we considered? Why didn't we choose those? What were the pros and cons of those approaches? And I always love when an interview tip is also the right, genuine way to become a better engineer, and asking these questions and preparing for your interviews during the project will help you do that. So to wrap things up, know that these innocent sounding questions in behavioral interviews are really digging for signal on specific traits. So don't try to answer with canned responses. To answer these well, really be present and answer questions directly. And to improve on this skill, use bullet points when you're preparing your answers, practice a lot with both your friends as well as with your team. And yeah, let me know if this is useful to you, if you agree or disagree, and if you have any questions. Would love to hear from you. And that's it for today. I will see you at the next coffee break with formation.